Hey everyone, welcome to another Lightroom workflow tutorial from Beyond the Lens Workshops. My name is Robert Rodriguez Jr. and it's great to be here sharing this with you, an image that I made recently right here in my backyard of the Hudson Valley. And it's one of the more difficult images that I've had to not only photograph but also edit in Lightroom, or I should say interpret, because that's really what I believe is the most important thing to do in Lightroom, is to take the vision that you start with in the field when you're making images, whatever inspires you to press the shutter, and then use that same vision to interpret the image in Lightroom creatively. And so not just finding out what can be done to the image, but how you can interpret the image so that your vision is maintained throughout the process. And for me, that includes making an actual print, which is something I shared in my blog post about making this image. And so it's when I make a print that I really get a sense of whether the image is working, whether I get the impression from the print that I got from making the image, and hopefully that's the same impression and the same vision that I can share with others. As I mentioned, this image was particularly difficult because of the nature of the image itself. Let me explain what I mean by that. You can see in the picture here there are kind of different layers to the image, and each layer sort of had a different quality of light to it. Kind of very strong here and direct in the foreground, bringing a lot of color, a lot of warmth, accentuating a lot of detail. Then we have the middle ground here, which is much flatter, much cooler actually than the foreground, and has a different quality of light. The sunlight was sort of being blocked by clouds on the horizon, illuminating different parts of the scene. And so it just wasn't hitting this middle area here. And then up towards the sky, some of the light was filtering out into the sky and creating more texture, more depth in the clouds that were also appearing over time. So when I first got to this particular spot in the Hudson Valley, the sky was kind of empty. There were no clouds at all, and slowly they started to roll in, and things were changing very, very rapidly, which was kind of a dynamic situation. And for me, the image is really about trying to convey that sense of being in a special place at a special moment. It's not about one particular subject in general, but just the overall impression of the image and how I felt about being there. And so that's what I want to bring across when I share it with others. And again, that's how I started in Lightroom. Now let me show you what the original capture looked like. Okay, this is the raw file without any edits whatsoever. Everything zeroed out in Lightroom. And then again, back to my final interpretation, which I'm happy with now. It may change over time. Again, a little perspective is always good when you're going back and revisiting images to see if it maintains sort of the integrity of your idea for the image. Not necessarily what I saw, but what I felt. That's really the most important thing. So again, back to the original. So let's get started with the workflow. First, I always like to start with white balance just to get a sense of the mood and feel of the image. The white balance or the temperature is going to affect whether it's cool, whether it's warm, and that really has a lot of psychological impact on how we perceive images. So I think it could be a little warmer. I'm going to go up to about 6200 in the temperature. And then exposure, I'm going to raise that up about half a stop. I think it could be a little brighter as well. I think I underexposed the image just a little bit, and making it brighter and a little bit warmer, you see, opens it up a little bit more, especially the shadows here, and gives a little more warmth to it. After that, I like to set the white and black point because that really expands my tonal range, and then I also have more to work with in terms of contrast and color and things like that. So I'm going to hold on the Option key, adjust my whites. I'm going to go up to about 30, about here. There's a little spot there clipping in the highlights. I'm going to adjust that later on with a local adjustment. So I'm going to go up to about 35. Same thing with the blacks. Come down to about 27 or so, 26, 27. There's a little clipping here, but as you can see, that's in the shadow areas of the tree. Don't have a lot of detail there. So again, that's okay. Remember, clipping in the highlights or the shadows depends on whether you want to preserve detail in those areas and also how you want the image to look overall. So I'm okay with that there. I'm going to add some clarity. That adds some contrast in the midtones, what we like to call local contrast. I'm going to add vibrance up to about 22 or 23. Okay, that adds a little more color to the image in an organic way, which is what vibrance does. I'm not going to adjust the saturation for now. I'm kind of happy with the color so far. Now, I kind of skipped over contrast here, and the reason for that is because depending on the image, I sometimes will prefer to use the tone curve. As a matter of fact, I probably prefer the tone curve most of the time because I get a little more control over the individual points in the curve versus this contrast slider, which is really just a sort of generic minus or plus. Not that this doesn't work. It works if that's all I need. But if I want more control, I will come down here to the tone curve and use this. I'm going to start here with the medium contrast setting, and I like to use the S curve here instead of the 4 independent sliders so that I can adjust the points individually. And I'm just going to raise my highlights a bit more here just to get a little more contrast in the highlights, but not affect my blacks too much, meaning that this here doesn't change, but my highlights I'm able to affect independently. Now I'm going to drop down to the HSL controls, and here what I did was I reduced the blue channel in the luminance. And the reason I did that is because I want to get a little more presence in the sky, make the clouds a little more dimensional, darken the sky a bit. And this is kind of like a virtual polarizer. So I'm going to reduce the blues here to about minus 15 or 18. And you can see I get better color in the sky, reduce the blues, a little more clouds. And I'm able to do that without using an actual polarizer in the field. This gives me a lot more control over the amount of polarization or darkening of the sky. I don't get that funny halo in the center when you use a very wide angle lens. So if and when I can use this, I do like to use it versus using an actual polarizer. Next, I'm going to drop down to detail. And for detail, you want to zoom in and view the image at 100%. Because otherwise you can't really tell what the sharpening amount and all the other controls are doing. So here I'm going to raise the amount to about 55 or so. Radius, I'm going to leave it about 1.0. Remember, with high frequency images like this one, you want to use a low radius. The detail slider here adds more sharpening depending on the radius amount. So I'm going to raise this up to 75 or so to enhance more of the detail, which I have a lot of here in the foreground. And then the masking control, which is a great feature of Lightroom, allows me to aesthetically hide some areas of the image from being sharpened. And it does that by detecting smooth areas and protecting it from the sharpening, but maintaining the sharpening on areas that need it, like, for example, the foreground here and some of the mountain ridges here, etc. So the way to use that, hold down the Option key, click and drag the masking control to the right, and you want to find a medium point or a compromise between too much protection, meaning areas that are going black are being protected from the sharpening, versus not enough protection. So I think around 30 works pretty well. And now you see that this area has been protected from the sharpening, but the grasses in the foreground, the trees, have a nice sharpening on them. And that really adds a lot of depth to an image, especially when you make a print, because then it moves things that are sharp closer to the viewer and things that are softer further in the back, and that creates that sense of 3 dimensions. Finally, noise reduction, just to get rid of some of this extra noise here in the back. I'm going to raise my luminance up to about 20 and my color noise reduction up to about 20, and that really eliminates any noise without affecting the sharpness of the image. Okay, so I like to start with getting the image kind of in the ballpark, as I've done now, and then move down to local adjustments, which allow me to really get into the nuances of the image and especially influence how a viewer is going to perceive the image, leading them through the image. And for me, of course, it starts in the foreground, then leads to the middle ground and up to the sky. And so one of the problems that I see with this image is that, based on what I've done so far, the foreground is very, very strong and attracts the eye very strongly. I don't want this to become a distraction. I also feel that it's a little bit too warm compared to the rest of the image, and if I cool it off, then I'll lose a little bit of the warmness that I want in the background here. So what I did was I'm going to use a graduated filter and add a graduated filter here just to affect the foreground. And the graduated filter works really well because it's pretty much on a straight line here. And here I'm going to drop the exposure down just a bit to make it slightly darker. And also I'm going to adjust the temperature slider down by -4. That cools off the foreground a bit. It's still warm, but to me it seems a little more in balance with the rest of the image. It kind of feels a little more unified. Next, I'm going to drop another graduated filter to improve the sky. I'm going to make it kind of wide. And then I'm going to drop this, actually that works pretty well, -0.30. Also drop my highlights a bit in this filter, about -15. And I'm going to boost the clarity to about 60 or so. That helps to define the clouds a bit more, darkens the sky a bit so that the exposure or the overall exposure looks a lot better. as I saw it when I was there for sure. Okay, that works pretty well. Now I'm going to add a couple of brush masks to enhance a few things in the image. Number one, I want to bring out this fog a little bit more. It definitely was pronounced to me when I was there, and it doesn't have that same feeling looking at the image here. So I'm going to add a new brush, and I'm going to use a lightening brush, just 0.25. And I'm going to brush this area in here just to add a little more emphasis on this foreground fog. Drop the flow amount here so that I can be a little more subtle with it here. And again, the flow is sort of like the opacity adjustment. So by dropping the flow, I'm able to apply this brush at 50% or 40% or whatever it is of what my overall setting is, which is 0.25. So I'm able to build up the effect. I also want to highlight this area right down here. All right, so that looks pretty good. Second thing is I'm going to add a new brush, and I'm going to make this a burning brush, I'm sorry. And I'm going to darken this area over here just because I don't want this to be a distraction. And I really didn't notice this all that much when I was there. It was kind of off to the side, but of course a camera captures everything. And so we need to interpret the image to lead the viewer. Once again, as I always like to say, through the image, show them what you found most interesting, your vision of what you saw, what you felt, etc. So darkening this kind of pushes it back into the background. And I'm going to add one more brush just to add a little more drama to the sky, and you'll see what I mean. So I'm going to brush in here, enhance some of these shadows in here. And this is at a minus 0.58, which I think is too much. So I'm going to back off on this a bit. So that's very subtle. Let me show you what it looks like without the effects and with those brush effects. So again, very subtle, but you can see it adds a lot of dimension to the image and gives it a lot more depth, which is one of the things that I'm most interested in. All right, so that's pretty much my final version of the image. At this point, if I wanted to add a little bit more highlights, I could come here and readjust my white point there, and that just brings my whites, or the white point in the image overall, just a little bit higher to maximize my tonal range, since I darkened the sky by itself before. All right, and that feels and looks pretty good to me. So I hope that was helpful and useful to show you how I kind of went through processing the image. And again, I'm always trying to think about how I want the viewer to perceive the image and what can I do to the image to strengthen that vision that I had originally. With my particular preference is to make it as organic and as natural as possible. You can choose to interpret an image whichever way you like, but that's sort of the approach that I take. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that. Any questions or comments or feedback, please let me know. Be happy to help as always. See you in the next one. Take care.